So in the first video, I talked about growing up in Staten Island in the 80s and 90s, not being aware that this huge, influential organization, secret organization, was all around me. Unlike a lot of people who grew up in places like Brooklyn and Queens, or who grew up within the local Italian community, who were aware of the Mafia, really, as an outsider, I wasn't aware of it as a child. So in this video, I'm going to talk about when I did start to become aware of it and what was going on at that time. So it was really around high school that I started to hear people talking about the Mafia in Staten Island. This was really amazing to me because it was like a shock. I mean, you know, as an adult, I had started to watch movies like Goodfellas, classic Mafia movies, Goodfellas, Donnie Brasco, and it never really seemed like something that happened where I lived. So then I started to hear people in high school saying that, well, this or that company that we all knew about, or restaurant or place, was connected to the Mafia or was owned by people in the Mafia. I started to hear that people I knew were connected to it, or even people that I knew would tell me about relatives of theirs that were a part of it. And this was like a shock. I was just like, really? I can't believe it. And then around this time, we're talking 1996, 97, I started to read the local newspaper. Of course, this was really before the internet era, so we were still reading like the old-fashioned paper newspapers. We had a local one in Staten Island, and then, of course, in New York, we have the New York Daily News and the New York Post. And started to see news about Mafia trials and the influence of the Mafia in Staten Island, and sometimes they were even they were names that I knew about or companies that I knew about. And I'm not going to get into which ones those were, but this was amazing to know about, because gradually I was starting to see that I did not live in just a typical American suburb that was the same as one in like California or Texas or something like that. Not that those kind of places don't have some kind of criminal underworld, but they didn't have this same kind of criminal underworld, and one that's so famous. So I already knew about the fame of the Italian Mafia, but I didn't know that it had so much power and numbers right where I lived. And that gradually I started to see that a lot of the things that I knew about, that they were behind it. Like, I started to see certain restaurants or certain lounges, for example, or the people who would frequent these places, and I started to connect the dots. Started to see, okay, these people look a certain way, they act a certain way, and that's because they're in some way related to this secret organization. So it started to change the way I looked at things. And when we're talking about the mid to late 90s, they still had a lot of power in New York City overall. They were still very influential in a lot of industries, big industries, and they had the power to threaten and shake down companies at that time. In a lot of ways, it was still business as usual at this time. A big case which attracted a lot of attention was a case involving the waterfront in Staten Island, and this also involved the actor Steven Seagal. who was involved with a lot of the people in this case. So Steven Seagal was in action movies in the 80s and 90s. He was actually very well known, and it turns out he had some kind of relationship with the Mafia, in particular the Gambino crime family. And Steven Seagal actually, I believe he lived in Staten Island for a while, and he had some kind of relationship where they were supporting him, but then it turns out they were blackmailing him, and there was a lot of back and forth. Anyway, they were threatening him at some point. And so something like this. Now, I knew Steven Seagal had lived in Staten Island before, and I just assumed, well, it's some kind of minor celebrity who lives in Staten Island, no big deal. And I had no idea that, like a lot of what I knew growing up, that the Mafia was in some way related to it. Another thing would be like the school buses. There was a big case, it was in the 2000s, involving school buses, that the Mafia was even influential in that industry and backing them up. And like buses, private bus lines and things. This was all public knowledge because they were coming out in cases. And now, a lot of what I heard about was news because there were, like I said, I was reading the newspapers and there were big cases going on. And what these cases were doing in a lot of ways was the end of the old guard of the Mafia. It was the end of the Mafia's heyday. Really, a lot of the big players in the Mafia, the last of the big players, were being brought down at this time. So you had the commission case in the mid-'80s, which like brought down the old-fashioned godfathers. Like a lot of the heads of the major Mafia families were brought down in the I believe it was 1985, 1986 commission case. And then things started to go into a little bit of a disarray, but they were still very powerful going into the 90s. But by the late 90s, the early 2000s, what I would say, the last of the old guard started to be brought down. And there were big cases involving, as I mentioned, the waterfront. That was, I believe, the Gambino and Genovese crime families. And then there was the Bonanno crime family, really, where a lot of the administration became informants and broke their oath of silence. There was the mob cops case where it turned out that two New York City policemen were on the payroll of the Lucchese crime family for many years. And these policemen had relationships with Staten Island as well. I think one or both of them lived there at one time. And you're just starting to see all over that a lot of important stories took place in Staten Island that were being revealed in these trials. But really what it was that the government was becoming more confident at that time, and the Mafia was going on the defensive. And so really what it was these trials was revealing that. And that was when I started to learn about all of this. And really what it was, by the early 2000s, you started to hear less and less about the violence of the Mafia. There were less news where it was like, okay, well, that was a Mafia hit, where you heard a story about some guy with an Italian name being killed and thrown in a trunk or something like that, and his body being discovered. Like, you just started to hear less and less stories like that. So really what it was, at the time I was becoming aware of their extent in the 90s and early 2000s, was really also the time of the decline of the Mafia.